There, friends. So we're continuing to dig into 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and just a few words about verses 10 to 16. This is fairly simple and straightforward stuff, but I'd encourage you to read verses 10 to 16. Pause the video at this point, do that, and then come back to me in a second. How did you get on? Well, I think this is a simple little section, fairly straightforward. And the overarching message here, I think, is that married couples are to remain married. That sounds fairly uncontroversial, I know, but there would have been some in the Corinthian church who would seriously been questioning whether or not that was the right thing to do because of some perception that it was more spiritual not to be married. And Paul really addresses this. So Paul began to answer a question that the Corinthians had raised about husbands and wives, and we looked at that in verses 1 to 9. And in verses 8 and 9 in particular, Paul addressed the unmarried people who may be contemplating marriage, encouraging both singleness and marriage, depending on the context. And his discussion now rapidly touches upon a variety of relationships. There should be no divorce, not even if a person is married to an unbeliever, when that unbeliever is prepared to live in the marriage. And if divorce does happen, he says, then the person divorced should remain single. The unbelieving husband or wife, or even the children of a mixed marriage, Christian and non-Christian, experience a special relationship to the faith and the Lord. And it's possible that the unbelieving spouse will be saved and come to faith. And the principle guiding what he says in these verses are laid out in verses 17 to 24, and we'll come to those in the next video. But let me just show you, share my screen and show you the very brief, simple structure of this passage so that it's clear in your head and in your minds as you read it. So what does he say? Paul's structure is clear and logical as his thought that progresses from the unmarried believers and widows that he mentioned in verse 8 to those believers who should get married, he mentions in verse 9. And so in verses 10 to 11, he then directs his thoughts to the married, specifically addressing matters of divorce. And he says separation and divorce should not happen. Christians married to unbelievers should not seek divorce, but a believing spouse may lead an unbeliever to salvation. And so what's the main thought of these verses? Well, I put it on the screen in this way. Christians should remain married and not be divorced from their spouses out of some concept of singleness being a greater spiritual calling. Even if married to an unbeliever, Christians should remain married unless the non-believer breaks up the marriage. And such marital faithfulness to an unbelieving spouse may indeed lead to his or her salvation. And in that, of course, we would rejoice. And this might be fairly simple and straightforward stuff, but I just wanted to briefly give you that simple explanation of what Paul says in these verses. Well, that's the end of this little video. The next one will cover verses 17 to 24. So go and check that one out now.